Welcome to a Leading Conversations Classic podcast. We've searched through our early episodes to find some of the best just for you. If you've been with us from the beginning, you may have heard some of these. If you haven't, enjoy this classic episode. Welcome to the Leading Conversations podcast, sponsored by the Excel Leadership Network. On each episode, J.D. Pairing will have conversations with church planting pastors and leaders from around the country. You can learn more about how to connect with Excel at the end of this podcast. Let's join J.D. now and listen in on this leading conversation.
It is great to have the legend here, Ralph Moore, who's, I believe, started more churches in North America than anybody but Jesus. So it's great to have you. Ralph is a friend. He is kind of retired, but working a ton as a retired person. His wife has told me, tell him to slow down. So anyway, hey, Ralph, I wanted to ask you a couple questions. Just real quickly, how did you get into church planting in the first place?
To me, going way, way back when I was a kid, I was in a Bible college, and I had grown up in the largest church in our denomination, which is also the largest church in Oregon. This is before the era of Rick Warren and Bill Hybels and all that, a huge church of 1,300 people. And so I go to this Bible college in California, and I found out that most of the churches in our denomination, a big church was 200. And so low expectations. And then I get all frustrated with the college. There was a professor who was just not teaching the Bible. I mean, he was teaching his Bible, not the Bible. And so I think, I know more than you, and he was bivocational, and I looked down on that at the time. So I started reading the book of Acts with an intent of proving them all wrong. And I was going to go out and figure out how to do Acts 2. And as I read it, my goal was to read it at least 5 times a week, the whole thing, my second year of college. I saw immaturity in the beginning, because new things are always immature, and maturity as it progressed. And that rattled my cage. I didn't know what to do with that, but I saw church multiplication. And I felt like I'm fairly smart, but I'm not real talented. And everybody I knew could play guitar, blow a trombone or sing or dance or something. And I just thought my best shot at making a mark in the world is to leverage whatever I have. And so I already was making disciples. I was working in a little church in the San Fernando Valley, and I had these 4 young boys I had started with, and 2 of those guys became pastors eventually. And I just I laid out a plan for my life that I'm going to start 5 churches, maybe 7 if I'm lucky. In each church, I'm going to raise up somebody that can take my place. And, the whole idea was I'll send them to seminary, whatever, and then I'll leave and I'll go start another one. And so as I began to really understand this, I read Jim Montgomery, and he had written a book called New Testament Fire in the Philippines about a church that had just turned explosive because they were training people through disciple making rather than through their Bible college. And disciples were training disciples, and many of them were becoming pastors who trained more pastors. And eventually I met the guy that was all about. And we were hot stuff. We were about, 125 people, 150 maybe, and we had started one church. And so he's a kind of a funny guy. He puts his arm around me and he whispers in my ear before church started. I'd never met him before. And he goes, so tell me, what are you going to do? Are you going to do great things for God? And I go, yeah. He goes, what are you going to do? I'm going to build the biggest church I can build. And he stepped away and he pulled my ear like this. And he goes, you didn't understand the question. And he asked the same question again. I gave him the same answer. And then he steps away further and kicked me in the shins hard enough that it bled into my sock. And he laughed at me. And he goes, you don't get it at all. If you want to do great things for God, what you're doing here is good. You just need to multiply it. And that was kind of where it all went. From there on, we began to realize all the stuff that was fuzzy in the background became intentional, and we started going from there. We were making disciples. We were, very kind of navigator oriented in those days, and the denomination had a lot of. First few churches that we started, not the first one, but after that, whenever they'd have an empty building and nobody knew what to do with, they were going to sell it. They'd call us up and go, "Do you have anybody that could pastor?" Well, we weren't training pastors. We were just making disciples who could make disciples. And we'd send them one of those guys, and it worked. And so that kind of got us some traction. And then again, we became more intentional. Guys started going, "God's calling me to Colorado," or "God's calling me to Washington State," and whatever. And so we went that road. And then when I left there, I was the 30th guy to leave the church I planted to go start a new one. And that was 12 years after we got going.
Wow. Now that was in Hermosa Beach?
Yeah, we started in a little town called Manhattan Beach.
Oh, Manhattan Beach.
And we moved to Hermosa about 5 years in. We bought an old bowling alley for church.
You need to know how brilliant Ralph is, because where he has lived, Manhattan, Hermosa Beach is just the nicest place in the LA area. And then he went to Hawaii, and then he retired to San Diego. So Ralph's just really smart. He doesn't know what it's like to live in terrible places, but he's just really smart. Tell us about that first plant, the first one you did. Not yours, first guy you sent out.
Okay, before I do that though, I got to tell you that when I was in my second or third year of college working with my young boys, and I was driving down Manhattan Beach Boulevard, coveting that town, thinking, I wonder if our denomination has a church in this town. And right then, it was right up there. I just looked out my car, there it was. And I started feeling guilty. I'm coveting this man's job because I like a beach town. And so I worked a lot with youth, and I was in camps. I never met a kid from that church. So I started praying, God send young people to that church. God send revival at church. I prayed for that church almost every day for years. And a friend who was like my older brother, a guy named Roy Hicks Jr., invited me to go to Eugene, Oregon, and take over a little church called Faith Center along with him. And I really wanted to do that. And I got on my knees and I heard the Lord. It's like I heard a voice right here, which I don't even believe in, but I heard it. And it said, "What if Manhattan Beach opened up and you were there?" So that's how I ended up at the beach. At Hawaii, where we were, just so you know, it rains 140 inches a year. And I lived there. I loved the people for 35 years. I hated where I lived. And I just couldn't wait to get back to California. I just had to get that little bit in there. The first church.
Kick us in the shin and make it bleed on how you did that first one.
The first one was an interesting deal. I was pastoring. I had learned to make disciples as a youth pastor. I was frustrated. It was fruitless for a long time, other than my disciple making. And I could pop, a little church of 150 people, I could pop 300 kids at a big event, but then nothing would happen. My youth group would be 20 something. And I felt pretty much a failure. And then the pastor got his goofy idea to do a Sunday school contest where you win prizes for bringing people to church. And we kicked it off in the high school group with a giant pizza breakfast. And one young girl who was a part of SDS, Students for Democratic Society, which were kind of like the groups that are rioting today, the Antifa and all that. And she was so busy doing that, she accepted the Lord. We went to her house and led her to the Lord, but then she wouldn't come to church. So we started, a deal of we go to the beach, but you got to bring your Bible and you got to tell what you got from the Bible during the week. And we snaked her into that. And that girl led 13 people to the Lord inside of a year. And then she started coming to church. And those people brought a bunch of people. And so then I went out and started the church. And very quickly, a guy named Virgil, who was into motorcycles, brought a navigator study into our church. A guy named Richard Agosino brought another navigator study into our. In fact, one of his guys dragged him in. And then there was another guy who brought a baseball team, a softball team into our church. And so the little tiny church, about 80 people, and I'm supposed to be the pastor, but actually there's 4 pastors. And I'm not happy about this. I'm resentful. I'm into positional leadership to some degree. And I got the title and they don't, but everybody's following them and not me. And I'm whining to the Lord. And I felt like the Lord spoke to me and said, you know how to make disciples. You need to disciple those 3 men. And it worked very well with Virgil and Agostino. And in fact, Agostino was like a first generation or second generation Italian. So he's still got the old world in him. And he's a very dominant guy. And so it was kind of, we're both Enneagram 8s, and only he's tougher than me. And one night we're at this Bible study, and he announces that God told him that he and I were going to become best friends. We're going to become David and Jonathan. And I'm thinking, who's David and who's Jonathan in all this? And he followed me out to my car, and I had a little Triumph TR3. It didn't have roll-up windows, had side curtains, and it was open. And he leans in my car and kissed me on the neck, a very Italian thing to do, but not a very American thing to do. And so, but his thing was, we're going to get up at 5:30 on Monday mornings and go walk around this golf course in Palos Verdes, California, which is right near where Dawson Trotman started the Navigators. So we kind of, both of us, we're young. We're in our like 26, 27. He was a year or two older than me. And we kind of felt like we're on holy ground. And we'd go up there and just walk and talk and pray. And then we had some people, there's no freeways in that part of the world along the coastal strip. We had some people who lived about 8 miles from the church in South Torrance. And they asked if Richard could come on Sunday nights and hold Sunday night church for them, because that was the days when you went to church 3 times a week. They had little kids, and it's hard to get back and forth twice on Sunday. Well, so we did. We started in a house. It was a micro church because 2 months in, they decided they wanted to be their own church. And so I told Richard, no way, because in our denomination, you got to go to Bible college or a seminary. They have a bylaw that they can only have one of their churches in a town. And they had already 2 in Torrance, California. So we would add a third. That would be against the rules. And then he wanted to call it Branch of Hope. And I was freaking out that somebody think we're trying to start a Hope Chapel denomination. And so I just told him no. And then later on, my friend Roy told me it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. So we just went ahead and started it. And I went and told the denomination later, and they actually blessed it. So that was a cool thing. And that's how it got going. And again, real strong emphasis on making disciples who made disciples. And so those guys within 5 years had planted 4 more churches and started a boys' ranch. They moved from a house there was a bar that had shut down, and they rented the bar. And in the city of Torrance came and had a really weird argument, because the bar was closed. But the argument was, we have a bylaw in the city that you can't build a bar near a church. So you can't have a church in a bar. And they kicked them out. And so then they met illegally in a park, and then they finally got a permit to be in the park building. And then after that, they rented a church building, and that church is still going strong all these years later. That was 1973. And Rich went on, there was a radio show, a guy named Rich Bueller in Southern California on a station called K-Bright in Orange County. Richard Agostino took Rich Bueller's place when Rich passed away, and that got him out of being a pastor. And eventually, I think now he's a mortgage broker or something. But one of his first generation disciples is the pastor of that church all these years later. So I think it's a really cool story.
That's cool. Hey, you mentioned starting in your 20s or your Bible college. And what are you, 29 now? But that was the 70s. And this is 2021. How have you stayed in for the long haul?
Early on, I mean, I never wanted to be a pastor. I wanted to be an architect, and I felt like I was drafted. And when you're drafted, you march, and you don't expect a whole lot. And so, churches grew big, all that, but I never could get off on all the accoutrements that go along with being a pastor. I just going to keep marching. And to me, marching meant making disciples and launching as many churches as we could, which isn't that many. I think we're good for about a church and a half a year throughout my entire tenure. And, but those guys, and a lot of them were one and done. They whatever we taught them, they went out the door, planted one church, and that was the end of it. There were always, every so often one guy would go nuts, and that's what you want, is those fanatics, those wonderful, wonderful, godly fanatics. And so a lot of the growth, I think that you could attribute me and first and second generation to about 350 churches. But then among them are those crazy guys. And here and there, you get somebody that there's 200 churches that grew up around this guy. One guy in Peru, who I had very little to do with him. I discipled a guy named Mike. He discipled a guy named Rick. Rick sold drugs to this young boy named Robert. Rick went to jail. Mike is praying all the time, got the whole church praying for Rick. Rick comes out of jail. Comes to church to beat up the pastor to get Mike off his back. And this old man reached out and put a bear hug on him and said, Jesus loves you and so do I. And it absolutely broke this very hard person. And he decided that I led this 17-year-old kid into drugs. I got to go find him and bring him into Jesus. And so I discipled Mike. A lot of it had to do with surfing. And Mike discipled Rick, and Rick discipled Robert Barringer. And now Robert Barringer pastors 10,000 people in Lima, and they've started 350 churches. That when you hear there's 2,400 Hope Chapels, well, that's a big part of the story. That's really the way a movement works.
Now, but you're still going strong in your 70s. I'm seeing a lot of guys, they want to retire and just, kind of go out to pasture. How are you doing that in the 70s? And what are you doing?
Oh yeah, I'm 75, and I pastored in Kaneohe for 27 years, and I handed it off to young generation. And then we started in the movie theater. We started all over, and I was like, I don't know, 66 years old, 68 years old, something like that, and it was fun. And in fact, actually, right now, I'm helping a guy by sending him bits and pieces, like a SD storage card and USB devices to upgrade a computer in Kenya. Some of our lay people went to Kenya from Hope Honolulu, and this guy now is planted there. He's discipled 60 church planters, and he was pastoring a church in an adobe brick building with a tin roof on it. And these guys taught him how to do home group, what we call mini church, and how to raise leaders from there. But when I retired, I moved here. I don't play golf. I would like to. I just don't know anybody that's as bad as me to go out with. Because if I go with good guys, I have no fun and I wreck their day. And so I don't surf. A couple of friends of mine drowned by having minor heart attacks when they're in the water, age 50 and up. And I thought I can't do that anymore. And so I was already doing a blog, and then I discovered podcasting, and it's exciting to me to work with all these young guys that I get to talk to. I just edited a podcast for tomorrow, a kid named Casey Crimmins in North Carolina, and he's just doing an incredible job. He had responded to my blog. I'd done a blog about the book, The Art of Neighboring, and what a horrible neighbor I am and how I'm learning to be better at it. And he wrote a comment, and it intrigued me. So I contacted him. And so we did this podcast, and their whole city is Charlotte, North Carolina, 100 churches went through a study of the art of neighboring together. But he began to realize that if you just minister to your neighbors, they probably look like you. And he started looking at demographics in the city and realizing there was redlining, and that mostly the white areas are where the money is. And if you're Hispanic or African American, that's where the poverty is. And so they decided that neighboring doesn't just include 8 houses up and down the street, we got to reach out of ourselves. They're doing an incredible job. But I just, man, I'm revved from actually listening to the interview we did 2 weeks ago, because I edited it today. So yeah, to me, it's just, I don't know how you let go of God or let go of a calling in your life. I do put in, I'll put in 25 to 35 hours a week doing, stuff like this. This is my third one of the week that I did a interview with somebody else for their deal. And I don't know, I just energize a bunny, keep on moving.
Hey, let's do this. Luke, why don't you ask one question? Brian, you ask one question, and then I'll just end and say after that, Ralph, whatever you want to say to us. But Luke, you got a question for Ralph?
Yeah. I like the phrase you mentioned, when you're drafted, you just march. I like that a lot. How did you convince your wife to continue the church planting deal? Moving and starting another one when.
I have the most wonderful wife in the world. That's how. Her name is Ruby. She grew up very poor. She went to Bible college so she could learn some Bible because, she wanted more. And we met. And she was only going to go for a year. And she stayed for a second year. And that's good because I came her second year. And she's just willing to trust the Lord. And so the hard move wasn't to move to Hawaii or to San Diego. Those, we both felt called, whatever. The hard move was going to Manhattan Beach because she had quit her job, 60% of our income, when our son was born. And he's 6 months old when the door opened to go to Manhattan Beach. And I walked in, it would mean leaving all salary behind. And we had enough money in the bank for a down payment on a house and like $25,000 house. And we could buy it, we had $2,200 or $2,300, something like that. And so we're going to use that money to start the church because there was just no church planting money available. There was a free building, which was nice. A little tiny building holds 66 people. But I walked in and I go, Manhattan Beach opened up. What do you think? Because we'd already been praying about this. We've been praying for this pastor in this town, and yet we felt called. And so she was ironing. The kid's sitting there with carrots, all over his face because he learned to eat with a spoon. And she just put the iron down and said, "Let's do it." And so it meant walking away from everybody we knew and loved and going to a place where we knew nobody. That was very lonely. And it meant walking away from money. We actually bottomed out to a point where I thought we were going to quit and go live in my dad's basement and sell used cars. But she's like that today. She's downstairs right now doing stuff so she won't disturb me while we're on this call. But she's ready to rock and roll. And so I've taken her all around the world to some pretty dark places that I go to train pastors, and she's just up for anything. So I don't know. Other than she's just a wonderful woman.
Great.
Ralph, you sent a lot of people out. You said some of them were one and dones and some of them really flourished. Was there a discernment process for you, something that you were looking for in these people, or specifically something you were equipping them with that kind of helped you multiply in this way?
Yeah, let me come at that from two angles. One is I believe that we should disciple our staff first. And so the way it worked was, we would build our small groups, what we called mini church, off the sermon. We always ask 3 questions because we want people to integrate what they learned in the Bible to their lives. What did God say to you while the pastor was talking? Because it might be different than the sermon. What are you going to do about it? Because now people are going to hold themselves accountable. They told their friends. And how can we help you? Spiritual gifts kind of emerge. We took that same model and we turned it into a training module for the leaders of those mini churches. And you couldn't come to our training if you weren't leading a mini church. And you could only get to be leading a mini church if the guy leading it discipled you to take his place and he went and started a new one. So it was always pass the baton. We're always replicating and multiplying. And so what at the bottom of this thing, what we're looking for is, do you have followers? You're not a leader, no matter how much schooling you have, if you don't have a follower, and that defines leadership. So in the mini church, if you're one of the people that people are following, then whoever's leading the mini church is going to want to disciple you, and that's how you get into this thing. And so that led toward a bunch of good pastors. We did the best job we could of brainwashing people by the books that we'd read, because we took that same little model in our leadership deals. I would disciple the staff. Each staff member had 5 to 8 mini church pastors, and it just radiated out from there. But we'd read books together. Some were business books, some are church multiplication books. Sometimes it's Romans or 1st and 2nd Timothy. But what we're dealing with is up here. It's intellectual. We're putting knowledge in your head. And the thing that we noticed is that the fanatics among us had been in our staff. They'd come up through the mini church, then they'd been on staff. And we just thought, until this book I just picked up this week, we always thought, well, staff's just a better training ground. And honestly, well, they get direct access to Ralph, so maybe that makes it better. But I just read this book called The Other Side of Church, and I would recommend it to anybody. There's some guy that's a neurologist who's also a Christian leader. I think he teaches in a seminary or something. And this engineer who had become a discipling pastor in a mega church, who left it because he was frustrated because people weren't growing in character. And there was so much narcissism in the church and unhealthiness, and he's wondering why. And he bumps into this guy who calls himself a neurotheologian, and but he's a neurologist, and he explains right brain, left brain. And right brain is artistic and all that, and left brain is logical. But right brain is where we experience joy and love and where community is meaningful to us. And I'm only in the 2nd chapter, but he's converted me. What I realize is that the people who excelled were the people who were brought into a certain kind of community where they were welcomed and they were loved, and they knew that they were loved, because it's what the whole focus of this book, or the premise of the book, is that if you get into a community where you feel belongingness and love, then you're going to adapt to those people, and it's going to change your character more than filling you with head knowledge will change your character. And I mean, there's got to be knowledge involved. The word has to be central to it, but the context. And as I'm reading the book, this is just yesterday, I'm thinking back to when I left California, when I left Hermosa Redondo Beach to move to Hawaii. I was so lonely for that place. I mean, I'm in Hawaii. I didn't for a while I lived where there's 140 inches of rain a year, and then I moved to where there's only 40. And there was beaches and all that. But I missed California so much for about 3 years. And now looking back at this book, I realized what it was is, like, on my way home from work, there's a place called Torrance Beach, and there's cliffs, and you can always see over the ocean. No matter what time of night I was driving home from work or riding my bicycle, because it was about a 5-mile ride, I would always stop at Torrance Cliffs, and there's always 3 or 4 or 5 people that I knew from the church or from surfing who are standing up there complaining about the waves aren't good enough. But they're always there, and they always welcome me. And I belong to that community, outside the church even. I belong to that community. And when I moved to Hawaii, it took 3 years to belong. And so now back to Brian's question, the better job we did of inculcating future church planters into a community, the better they absorbed what we were all about. And I really believe that there is something to this. And it makes me realize that the successes we had, because we hardly lost any pastors to immorality or heresy or anything like that. And the successes that we had in the mini church, we thought the mini church was so cool because they were learning stuff, because they learned from somebody preaching on the weekend and now they ingrained it in their brain. But I'm of the belief now, I got converted yesterday, but they were taking that Bible knowledge in this context of community. And when he talks about the other side of church, I don't even know what the heck he's going to say other than right brain, left brain. Here's what I say. Acts chapter 2, 41 to 47. There's two sides of church. One is in community and one is in the temple courts. And you can't have community in the temple courts, but you can have community in a bunch of houses where they're eating food together and doing all that. And so, I think that I would probably be able to, and I'm not going to do this, but I'd probably be able to do a study of who thrived and who didn't thrive, or who multiplied and who didn't multiply. And it would relate back to, how much of what they absorbed in a fellowship of love.
Wow. Hey, we're just about out of time. 1 minute, Ralph. What else do you want to say to us? What's the last word?
We, the church, have forgotten about evangelism. We learned how to build mega churches, super churches. Come listen to my pastor. And inviting unchurched Harry and Mary to church is not the same as evangelism. Getting out of yourself, hanging out with people, having coffee with people that you don't barely know. Me hanging out with my neighbor this morning for an hour when I was really busy trying to get ready for the stuff I had to do. That's crucial. And if we can get back to that, we can get to the point of, and I think this is really important, making disciples before they believe in Christ. Follow me as I follow Christ is what Paul said. And again, relationship, very important.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ralph. Thanks for that. Just great to hear different parts of your story. Thank you for what you've done. I think you kicked us all in the shin a little bit today. I'm not sure there's any blood. And I don't think you kissed us on the neck, but you did kick us in the shin. So thank you. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for joining the Leading Conversations podcast. We hope that you found it both helpful and encouraging. At Excel Leadership Network, our focus is on the church planter rather than the church. If you'd like to find out more about us, visit our webpage at excelnetwork.org. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. See you next time with another Leading Conversation.